Right now we have Sam Belfield. He's a businessman and I could say he's an apostle for the human condition. He's going to talk to us about dignity and self-respect, and in particular, keeping that in mind with the Charlie Kirk murder that happened just recently. Welcome to the show, Sam.
Good morning, Cheryl, and good morning to your listeners.
Thank you, Sam. It's a very important topic, isn't it? One thing that I find really interesting is that the media will hype up such a tragedy as the Charlie Kirk murder, and then it disappears, and yet we're all left to have to recover. And one of the issues that you and I discussed, which is why you are on the show today, that is that dignity and self-respect plays into these tragic events. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yes, certainly, Cheryl. I mean, something that prompted that, that topic in my mind was in the days after the assassination and murder of Charlie Kirk, I caught a tweet by Russell Brand, and he was making the point that, you know, the spiral of radicalisation, hate, as compared to respectful conversation, kindness and compassion. And there was a sort of a torrent of backlash to him sort of trying to mediate a constructive path forward. And he was sort of highlighting, you know, is it possible? I wonder if those who, you know, loved and respect Charlie Kirk, whether they were able to extend kindness and compassion. And he sort of said, I wonder if you can. He posed that question. And that sort of very much brought to the front of my mind this concept of, well, how do we mediate that, and how do we restore that dignity?
So essentially what we're saying, if we lack the ability to be compassionate in a difficult time, it may well be because we lack compassion for ourselves. Is that where the dignity part comes in?
I think that's definitely the case, Cheryl. I mean, my view is that and it goes very much to the point you just touched on, where we have these horrific situations, and but then not long after and there's an immense sort of upwelling of all these emotional reactions, but then not long after that we move on. And I'd like to suggest that what happens in a situation like this is that, in a sense, the mask slips, or there's a tear in the matrix, if you like, where this underlying issue of the human condition is brought into focus, and that's very distressing, daunting, confronting for us. And then you see these reactions from both sides, you know, if you want to call it the left and the right, or those who are pro-Kirk and those who are anti-Kirk. And you end up with this very vitriolic sort of polarised situation. And I'm suggesting that that's a defensive reaction to the fact that this common, shared, underlying issue of the human condition is being brought into focus. Essentially,
are we talking fear as well?
Absolutely. I think fear, that you're really hitting the nail on the head there, in the sense that, again, when a situation like this happens, we personally have to account for, well, this is just another human that's done this, or this has happened to. We may not necessarily be able to relate to how and why they've done that, but this is not someone else. This is not another species. This is another human. This is one of us that has, you know, in this case, committed an atrocity. And then also, when you look at the spectrum of reactions, the anger, the hatred, again, from both sides, and I'm not seeking to obviously condone any sort of aspects of this. My focus is on looking at the reactions and trying to understand and make sense of where that's coming from. And the way to do that, I believe, is, it touches on that point you're making. It brings us into contact with the fear of this underlying issue of the human condition, and that's what results in these, very emotional reactions.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, I suppose the message for our listeners is that if it can happen to anyone, it can also happen to us. And when I say anyone, I've said that generally. In this instance, it was Charlie Kirk, and he was a prominent figure in the United States. His legacy, let's pray, continues. However, in any circumstance, if it's someone that we don't know, who doesn't have a public profile, who has had some sort of tragedy occur, that they've been murdered on the street or in a car accident, the same thing applies. Yet I find often those sorts of deaths are, again, sensationalised in the media for that split second, potentially without consideration of the grief and pain those close to them are suffering, and then, as you say, the flow-on effects of that.
Yeah, absolutely, Cheryl. And again, I think it comes back to your point about that fear. And what I suppose I'm particularly interested in is how do we break that cycle? And I suppose I'm suggesting that what we need to actually do is address that fear. We need if you like, truth or honesty or transparency. We need insight into what is this underlying sickness that we, if you want to use a sort of an emotive term, the sickness of the spirit, this what we're trying to describe as the issue of the human condition, this inner, I think you used the word self-hate a moment ago, where does that come from? What's the root psychological cause of that fear? And if we can bring insight to that fear and ameliorate that, heal that, understand where it comes from, then all of a sudden, rather than having to, in a sense, have this overreaction, emotive reaction at the time, and then, in a sense, recoil out of there and just move on down the line until it happens again, what we can actually do is we can constructively make sense of what is this domain that is producing this upset, and we can begin to heal that. And that's what I suppose, in terms of the work I do, supporting the work of Australian biologist Jeremy Griffith, suggesting that there is a simple yet profound insight that actually extinguishes that core fear. It allows us to go into this domain that, someone like the French philosopher Pascal referred to us as the glory and the scum. We've got this contradictory capacity as humans, and when we focus on that, it does produce that fear that you're referring to, and it's born of that, again, that self-hate that you're talking about, that day to day we're not necessarily in connection with, but we need a framework of insight to go into this domain and safely address it.
And that also includes making sure that we, I suppose, if I could say, relinquish the blame game. So if all humans go through this process of, I would say, human suffering with this fear and guilt and anger and confusion, then that is generational, and it's always been the case as a human species. So to suggest that our behaviours and the consequences of our lives today are the result of what our parents did, and then they do the same, and so on, it goes through generations, we're not solving anything really. We're just passing on that fear to the next generation.
Absolutely would agree with that, Cheryl. I think that in terms of the work I do and the work of Jeremy Griffith, this concept of there's this accumulating or escalating upset with each generation, and there's no blame in that. We're suggesting that there's a very good reason why, as a species, over hundreds of thousands, millions of years, we've had this accumulating psychological upset. And if we can come through that gate, if you like, that framework of explanation, then all of a sudden we can take the heat out of it, we can take the personal out of it, that blame, that shame that you're referring to. And, for example, rather than referring to, if you look at the people who were at glee at the fact that Charlie Kirk was murdered. Now, that is, people variously describe that as evil, as, there are people on the right saying, we need to crush these people. That ultimately doesn't take us anywhere. We need to bring insight to that. I mean, John Anderson in a podcast sort of said, what have we come to? How did we get to this? Now, I would suggest that the deeper explanation of how did we get to this is that along the lines of what you're referring to, which is that there has been this accumulating upset, and if you like, humans, us, are coming apart at the seams in terms of being able to cope with this underlying issue that day to day is, in a sense, kept in check, but we have events in life where that subterranean reality comes to the surface, and it's very distressing, it's very shocking, it can be very destructive, but we need an insight to that can, as I say, assuage and reassure us from that fear.
Indeed. So, Sam, we're talking about being present, being fully aware in the moment, listening and making sure we're hearing what other people are saying. We then start to get an insight into their emotion and the actions as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a key concept in there for me, Cheryl, is rather than dehumanising and externalising other people and people literally are describing the people on the other side of the aisle as them and they, as some sort of unrelated collective. we need to, in a sense, bridge that gap. We need a framework of knowledge that, in a sense, allows us to acknowledge this sort of shared universal underlying condition, and from there we can, in a sense, have a constructive conversation. And I'm not suggesting it's about placating or pandering to, destructive positions or moral relativism or anything like that. I'm saying, in a sense, we need brutal honesty, but hand in hand with compassion, one that restores dignity and respect. Because at the end of the day, again, it goes back to your key point that lack of self-respect, that lack of dignity, I would suggest, is at the heart of what generates this destructive and obviously clearly unacceptable behaviour. But rather than compounding that with further dehumanisation and guilt and recrimination, that just compounds the very issue that is actually generating the destructive behaviour in the first place.
Sam, you're a man of wisdom, and I thank you so much. You're essentially shining a light on what it is to be human and how we can continue to live our lives, however, making sure the light is on so that we do all shine. Thank you very much, Sam. It's great to have you, and I look forward to having you back so we can talk more about the human condition.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. A pleasure as always.
Thank you. You're on 88.9 WynFM, the Cheryl Lacey Show, and that was just Sam Belfield there talking about the human condition and the impact of terrible, terrible events such as the Charlie Kirk murder and how we manage that as humans and the importance of self-dignity. So there is always something to consider, to stay curious about on this show, and be courageous when it comes to making change for you and your life and your family.